General Whiting started off with a great speech that gives us some incredible insight into the kind of challenges that we're facing in the future and how we need to approach them. This next panel, we're going to be going ahead and talking about SSA and its effect on enhancing security and deterrence for the world. And I'm pleased to be joined by three fantastic panelists up here this morning. We're going to follow a normal format as you've seen many times before, where each of our panelists will get an opportunity to say a couple of remarks for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. I'm going to take the prerogative, since one of our 4 scheduled panelists is not here, to go ahead and just say a couple of remarks of my own. And we were talking about this last night as we were getting ready for the conference. You know, there's a question of how do you do deterrence in space, and if you look at the national space, the security strategy and the national defense strategy that was recently published, and the excellent work done by folks like Sean Kirkpatrick, and I don't know if Sean is still in the room, but if he is, we should all give Sean a great round of applause of thanks for the great work he did on the national security strategy. There he is. So Sean, stand up, Sean. So in that strategy, it talks about these 19 critical interests that we have with the United States of America, space being one of them, critical infrastructure items, space being one of them, and it basically says that we will meet attacks on our critical infrastructure, including space, with a response in the time, place, and domain of our choosing. And those are pretty strong words and very important words for the world to hear. But we also know that deterrence just doesn't come from retaliation. Deterrence comes from more things than just threatening to fight back. And the SSA is one of those critical areas for which we can use to enhance our deterrence, because SSA allows us to call out bad behavior before it becomes awful behavior. It allows us to go ahead and point to what others are doing in space that they would just as well not have us know that they are doing in space. I think the biggest deterrence effect that I've seen in this regard was the shoot down of the Chinese satellite in 2007. It was very interesting. Of course, there weren't that many countries who could actually track what the Chinese were doing or knew that a satellite had been shot down. One of the amazing things about space is when things happen in space, almost nobody knows about it unless a national entity, a government, tells us that something happened in space. Now, that's becoming less and less the case as more commercial SSA comes to the fore, but certainly in 2007, when we were just starting down the commercial SSA revolution, the US government and some allied governments pointed to what the Chinese did and said, you just created a whole bunch of debris, and that debris is harmful, and that debris will hurt the future uses of space for all mankind. And the resounding uproar from the world community on the amount of debris that was caused by the Chinese has resulted in the fact that in the 11 years since, not a single destructive ASAT test has been done by the Chinese or by any other nation. That's a form of deterrence, because that deters the development and the testing of weapons that can go ahead and hurt in space. And SSA led to that. It wasn't a threat of retaliation against the Chinese shooting down their own satellites. It was SSA and the shared view of all spacefaring nations that creating debris in space is bad, that now deterred future debris-causing events. That's, in my mind, the highest level that we can expect from how SSA can help deterrence. But you're not here to hear me talk about that. You're here to hear our panelists talk about that. So let me introduce them one at a time, and I'll ask them to give them remarks. Our first panelist is Dr. Regina Peltzis. She's a policy officer from the German Space Agency and the Department of Space Situational Awareness. She leads the German delegation to the consortium implementing the European Space Surveillance and Tracking, SST, support framework for the European Commission, and serves as the co-chair of its steering committee. From 2013 to 2015, Regina was an internal research fellow with ESA's European Space Operations Center, Special Studies and Special Projects Division, and prior to that, she contributed to various future systems and safety projects, including the ESA Astronaut Training Division, Special Skills and Exploration Unit. She holds a PhD from Kingston University, London, on human systems integration and exploration class missions. Dr. Peltis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I get to be first. Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Doug, for your remarks and for your introduction. Yeah, I'm with the German Space Administration. We've been evolving our capabilities in the past 10 years very much. But I was asked this morning to contribute a perspective on European SST capabilities and how that's been developing and how this will pan out in the next, let's say, decade. And my remarks are very much informed by our contribution of our agency to the European Space Surveillance and Tracking Support Framework, which you just outlined. I have the pleasure of working on. The EOSST, it's called EOSST, was set up in 2015 on a decision for the European Commission to network existing assets in sensors, processing, and services of different European member states, to network them together, develop and upgrade them further to provide an emerging SST capability in Europe. And so to this end, a consortium was formed some years ago. We started operating in 2016 between 5 member states, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK. And we're supported by another EU agency, the Satellite Center, who usually do geospatial intelligence, but who support us in service provision as the front desk for EOSST. We started delivering 3 services: collision, fragmentation and re-entry, warning services to, by now, I think over 70 users. We cover over 100 spacecraft in 3 orbital regimes. And some of our colleagues who are here at the conference, you can go and talk to them, who are involved in the operational and technical side, especially for collision avoidance. This year, we are enlarging from the current 5 member states that we're collaborating with, European Union member states, to 8. We're also going to be integrating Poland, Portugal, Romania. They applied to the Commission in a process that was managed by the EU to demonstrate that they have certain assets that they want to contribute to the consortium, and they will be joining us at the end of the year. So we're going to have a membership kind of governance of 8 member states in Europe. And this model of governance of individual sovereign member states is unique in Europe as a form of collaboration for space. Usually the large flagship programs are managed on a basis of the 28 member states of the European Union working together. If you think of Galileo and Copernicus, for instance, the navigation and Earth observation programs. But to frame it for our panel's perspective, we can say that EOSST, beyond being a growing and emerging operational capacity and infrastructure, it's also an exercise in transparency and confidence building of these states moving together, sharing different issues from the policy down to the operational and even data processing aspects, so all the way down the entire value chain in operations. At the same time, this framework, EOSST, is just one aspect of an ecology or an ecosystem in Europe that's rapidly evolving and consolidating at the moment in space. Especially for SSA, it's a very, very dynamic time at the moment. As some of you may know, that a proposal has been tabled for a European space program before the summer, which is currently being discussed by 28 member states as we speak. I think the SST component was discussed last night. Probably finish now or continue talking. And so next to the main flagship programs, Galileo, Copernicus, which are the main parts of this program, you have an SSA and SST component in order to protect these space-based systems that are owned by the European Union. And the idea is that to attain a certain level, they say certain level of autonomy in protecting own systems, but also to contribute to a global effort. As you can imagine, this discussion currently is characterized by a great diversity of different actors. In the domain, we can broadly categorize them in 4 large stakeholder groups. These are the member states, on the one hand, the individual states that may have their own national programs, their own national capabilities, bilateral, trilateral, multilateral engagements. Then you have the European Union as a supranational entity with a set of 28 member states. You have the European Space Agency, which is an intergovernmental agency with a largely similar but slightly different set of member states. So there are major overlaps, but not quite. Again, NATO then is another story in terms of membership. And you have industry who's increasingly vocal about what they can bring to the table in the SSA domain in Europe. And of course, since this came up earlier today, already after the keynote, industry in Europe is organized in a slightly different way than here, so the collaboration aspects are still in a norming and forming phase. All these actors bring a lot of different capabilities, interests, agendas, interactions with them that spans anything from security policy to industrial policy, interests that range from regional development to business cases. So it's very diverse and it needs to be reconciled at the moment. So you can say that they're currently engaged in a kind of civilized wrestling match about governance. Who's going to do what kind of capabilities do they want to evolve? How ambitious do they want to be? How do you trade off redundancy of different systems that you have in Europe, or duplication of systems and frame it as redundancy, for instance? And essentially, this debate is about how serious Europe is in terms of global burden sharing in the SSA domain. So that's the main frame. And with this, I think I conclude.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Our second panelist is an old friend, Dr. Jana Robinson. She is currently the Space Security Program Director at the Prague Security Studies Institute. She previously served as a Space Policy Officer at the European External Action Service in Brussels, as well as a Space Security Advisor to the Foreign Ministry in the Czech Republic. She's an elected member of the International Institute of Space Law and the International Academy of Astronautics. She's also a member of the Advisory Board of the George C. Marshall Missile Defense Project for the Center of Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Dr. Robinson holds a PhD from the Charles University Faculty of Social Sciences Institute of Political Studies in the field of space security, as well as 2 master's degrees from George Washington University and from Palacky University in Olomouc. Is that right?
Almost.
Okay, there you go. Dr. Robinson.
Thank you, Doug, for your kind introduction. First, I'd like to thank the organizers of the AMOS conference, especially Sandy Ryan and her team, as well as the Secure World Foundation's Brian Whedon and Victoria Sampson to bring me over here. I was here actually in the inaugural policy forum, which was 6-7 years back, and I have been impressed how much this forum has expanded into a world-class event, and for very good reasons. I was asked today to discuss the role of SSA and transatlantic relations and security more broadly. As we know, the United States has by far the world's most formidable space capabilities. It has strategies in place that essentially provide the architecture of national security space. In addition, the US is discussing the organization of a future space force designed to enhance deterrence and warfighting effectiveness, including resilient infrastructure and combat-ready space operators. The key drivers of why the United States is now focusing more on space warfighting readiness is concerned about actors which it terms near-peer competitors, namely China and Russia, that are contesting this operational domain through asymmetric means. From our vantage point in Europe, I think it's fair to say that there is a widening transatlantic gap with regard to addressing space security concerns. On the positive side, there is considerably more skepticism toward China and Russia in Europe. Examples of Europe hardening the economic and national security attitudes toward these authoritarian space powers include, for example, efforts to implement security minding, screening mechanisms to Chinese foreign direct investment in certain European countries, French and British vessels transiting disputed waters in the South China Sea in freedom of navigation exercises, and increasing attention to cybersecurity and intellectual property theft. In its recent report on space hybrid operations, our institute emphasized that space should not be treated differently from other warfighting domains, including in the economic and financial arena. A new dynamic is taking hold in space that has significant implications for policy development related to space situational awareness, space domain awareness, and space traffic management. The technical definition of SSA is that it helps characterize objects, identify their owners, infer their capabilities, calculate their future trajectories, and decipher their intent. How does this definition incorporate new elements of the threat environment, such as reversible, temporary, and hard-to-attribute actions or activities that we call space hybrid operations? The question is, under which of these categories can we develop a more holistic strategy to deter Chinese and Russian malign behavior in space? For example, are space hybrid operation and SSA, STM, or SDA issue? How do we characterize it? Whose job is it to take an inventory of emerging threats and craft appropriate responses? Is it an alliance-wide concern? On these latter questions, I believe the answer is yes. In terms of space hybrid operations, we are already seeing a ramp-up by China and Russia in dazzling, jamming, and rendezvous and proximity operations. I don't have to persuade this audience that there are a broad array of ground-based, non-kinetic effects that can be applied against space assets. A new element of space security and deterrence I'd like to introduce today involves Chinese and Russian proliferation of space partnership arrangements. These seemingly benign arrangements to provide non-traditional spacefaring nations with limited capabilities, such as satellite, launch services, ground station, and so on, to supposedly improve the prosperity and security of the targeted countries, are not exercises in altruism. Such partnerships are rather driven by a desire to gain influence or even take control of the nascent space sectors of countries such as Pakistan, Bolivia, Nigeria, Belarus, or South Africa. BSSI has termed this activity space sector capture, and as you might imagine, involves providing a vertically integrated package of space equipment and services. When I say vertically integrated, I'm basically envisioning Beijing and Moscow offering satellites, launch services, ground station construction, Beidou and GLONASS SSA services, operating personnel, and arguably, most importantly, large-scale subsidized financing. It is not hard to understand that the kind of leverage that accompanies countries lured into this package approach to their respective space sectors under the guise of cooperative international space partnerships. This is an area that we are presently researching as the US and its allies in Europe and beyond seek to expand their own international partnering arrangements. They may not be fully aware how robust a competition is emanating from the world's two leading authoritarian space powers. I don't wish to dwell on this subject further, but wanted to serve it up as yet another illustration of space-related threats that require awareness. I can't resist one more example in this regard. Beijing has an elaborate satellite and space mission control station in Argentina, a $50 million project that was arranged during the Kirchner regime at the time when the country had been shut out of international credit markets for defaulting on about $100 billion in bonds. It is, in effect, a military compound. Argentinians are not welcome to enter the heavily guarded premises, and the 494 acres of the land surrounding the station has been contractually secured for 50 years, rent-free, mind you, as the sovereign territory of the PRC, much like an embassy. Although it's difficult to learn of the station's capabilities in the open source, one can reasonably surmise that it's not a do-good civilian enterprise. In closing, I've been impressed by the pace of Chinese and Russian acquisition of ever more sophisticated counter-space capabilities, fevered outreach to foreign countries with space partnering packages, and diplomatic activity, such as the new group of governmental experts on prevention of arms race in outer space at the Conference of Disarmament, or the currently ongoing Conference on Space Policy and Law in Moscow. Western governments are losing space partners at a steady rate, and private sector firms are losing business to authoritarian competitors on an unfair, non-market basis. It tells me that a new think is required on space domain awareness, which might serve as an appropriate repository of such emerging space concerns or threats. It also strikes me that now would be an ideal time to step back and take stock of the threats to space security that could be addressed under space situational awareness or space domain awareness internationally. In the US, probably housed at the National Space Defense Center, and maybe CSPOC for the collaboration with other partners. One way or another, a more holistic approach to situational awareness appears required, including its economic and financial dimensions, which have heretofore almost never seen the light of day. I will stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Mr. Scotty Van Sant. Scotty's assigned to the United States Strategic Command, Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska, in the Policy Division, and he's currently the lead for US Stratcom's Space Situational Awareness and Data Sharing programs. Scotty served 20 years and a month, I don't want to forget the month, in the United States Air Force. Just got it, just past the wire there. Where he culminated his career as liaison to the DoD Human Spaceflight Office and the Operationally Responsive Space Project Officer. In the last 7 years, Scotty's team at US Stratcom has successfully negotiated and concluded SSA data sharing agreements with Israel, Italy, Germany, France, Spain, UAE, Belgium, Norway, and Denmark, and they are currently on a quest to complete negotiations with 10 other nations. That's fantastic. Scotty, please.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you. Good morning, distinguished guests and colleagues. I'm really honored to be here to speak to such a talented audience. Thank you to the organizers of the AMOS conference. I've not been here since 2005, and it's really good to be back here, despite Olivia. As Doug informed you, I'm a retired Air Force officer, and since 2011, I've been serving in a civilian capacity in the Policy Division at United States Strategic Command. Thinking back to this past June when I received the invitation, I was initially excited and honored to be recognized as an expert on SSA. Those of you in the audience who know me probably chuckle at that statement since you know that I studied military history in college. I did go on to get a master's degree in space systems, but my wife and many others had to tutor me long hours on calculus. My second thought after receiving this was a bit of dread, considering I'm here representing United States Strategic Command, the very first organization to publicly state that space should be treated like all the other domains, that it's not special, that warfighting in space is a real possibility. I wondered, what am I, the government's lead for SSA data sharing, a program whose primary goal is the safety of spaceflight operations for all nations, going to say, because clearly a war in space would be contrary to the goals of the SSA sharing program. So after I overcame my dread, I started to think about the topics outlined for me on this panel, improvements in SSA and the role of SSA in deterrence. First and foremost, SSA and deterrence go hand in hand, but we have to remember that deterrence is a multi-domain activity. We cannot deter adversaries in only one domain. It must be a concerted effort across all domains in order to be the most successful. But for the purposes of this panel, I'll focus on our improvements in SSA, the role in deterrence, recognizing it as part of a larger strategy. As far as improvements in SSA, in addition to the things that General Whiting mentioned, I know there are a lot of us who are both excited and daunted by the new space fence that's going to be coming online very soon. which may allow us to track an additional 200,000 objects, considering today's catalog has about 23,000. It's pretty exciting, but also makes a lot of us very anxious. Additionally, the relatively new operational status, and General Whiting mentioned this briefly, of the Combined Space Operations Center's non-traditional data preprocessor will allow us to bring in observations from our allies and partners. But the increasing amount of data, available data, is only one part of our plans to improve SSA. Transparency must be included in this discussion. As General Whiting mentioned, most of you know that the U.S. government collects a lot more information about space objects than it makes available for public consumption on spacetrack.org. In November of 2017, General Hyten, the current commander of U.S. Strategic Command, understood where the new administration planned to go with regard to space and directed his components to determine how we could change our data sharing procedures, make more information available, increase the size of the public catalog, thus increasing transparency, but still maintaining security of our satellites. Naturally, this plan was met with some degree of trepidation, but I won't name any names. However, we are moving forward with testing and evaluation to make sure we meet General Hyten's intent smartly and efficiently. Even now, efforts are moving forward, so stay tuned to spacetrack.org for more information on this long overdue transparency effort. Near and dear to my heart, a very public and very successful way to increase SSA's role in deterrence are the SSA sharing agreements that Doug mentioned. Since 2011, my team has negotiated and concluded 17 SSA sharing agreements with other nations and over 70 with commercial entities. These agreements enable the U.S. government to provide advanced SSA services and data to these agreement holders. Services such as advanced conjunction assessments, launch anomaly support, and assistance with electromagnetic interference. SSA sharing agreements also allow the U.S. to share more information in a timely manner with a broader range of partners. The U.S. aims to promote an interactive exchange-based relationship with the satellite owners and operators. This open exchange of information also supports efforts to detect, identify, and attribute actions in space that are contrary to the responsible use and long-term sustainability of the space environment. The SSA agreements also reduce the potential for debris-producing collisions and other harmful interference and build international confidence in the responsible use of space systems. While these agreements are bilateral, U.S. Stratcom encourages further expansion to more multilateral efforts and more comprehensive sharing agreements among governments and other operators across the globe. The SSA sharing program has been a success from day one, but the agreements are really just a stepping stone to other activities that increase our resilience and build trust between like-minded nations, contributing to the overall deterrent effect. Another recent success story is the multinational space collaboration effort at Vandenberg Air Force Base. Co-located with the 18th Space Control Squadron and the nearby Combined Space Operations Center, the MSC seeks to explore mutual capabilities and identify opportunities for greater integration with additional partners by co-locating international liaison officers with U.S. space operators. The MSC is growing from a single German officer in 2017 to most recently a British and a French liaison have been added just in the last 3 months. 7 other nations have been invited and many are in negotiations to send liaison officers. These officers are key to the eventual and necessary integration of their nations into the CSPOC. Another example of SSA's contributions to deterrence is called Global Sentinel. Global Sentinel, a U.S. Stratcom-hosted tabletop experiment held at the Lockheed Martin Lighthouse facility in Suffolk, Virginia this very week, is designed to provide partner countries and commercial entities the opportunity to collaborate on combined SSA operations. This year's Global Sentinel will include space experts from 14 nations: Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, United Kingdom, the Republic of Korea, Spain, Japan, Denmark, Chile, and Norway, and of course the United States. Although we at Stratcom seek to ensure space is a peaceful domain for the benefit of all, As we've mentioned, anti-satellite capabilities are in development, have been developed, and due to the dramatic expected increase in satellite population, the space environment is increasingly congested. In an environment of increasing uncertainty and emerging threats, the ability to confront these evolving challenges in a coalition takes on new importance. The U.S. is committed to maintaining the long-term security and sustainability of the outer space environment for the international community and our allies and partners. To that end, U.S. STRATCOM will continue to help fulfilling this commitment. The U.S. has always appreciated the incredible support from our allies and partners to deter threats from our adversaries. In this time of increasing defense costs and the possibility of conflict extending to space, we ask our allies and partners to continue their cooperation and further collaboration in space initiatives, thus increasing SSA's role in deterrence. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the conference and any questions from the audience.
So for all of the panelists, given that we think that SSA leads to greater security and greater deterrence for all, and the cost and complexity of truly creating a real-time SSA picture is outside the reach of many nations, in your view, should there be an international SSA database that is the product of all of our capabilities and managed as an international resource in the same way as we have international databases for maritime traffic and aircraft traffic? Please.
A yes/no question.
Got to do more than yes/no.
I think from our perspective, what's happening in Europe, perhaps we can see from our experience how challenging it is to integrate different actors and different sources of data, and especially in terms of governance. I think it goes without saying that the more data we have, of course if we use it properly, but the more data we have from different sources gives us a more reliable and robust base on which to ensure safe operations. So operational safety is one concern, but also at the same time to address security concerns and make things more transparent. Having said that, of course, currently in Europe, the framework that we operate is that sovereign member states retain control over their sensors and their data processing capabilities. That means up to a certain level, it is still contained in this member state framework. Of course, there are bilateral sharing agreements. In fact, Europe is much characterized by this architecture of bilateral sharing agreements. So the idea also for the next space law or this regulation that's coming out, they have proposed that there should be a European catalog. And that's the goal, of course, in networking assets and putting them together. But the question is the governance and how long this very new model that we're operating with these sovereign member states who then contribute their assets to the greater community, how long that's going to hold, or whether we indeed need something where we trade off operational safety and security, and the sovereignty issue, is treated in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Jana?
Just very briefly, I think that inevitably for safety of space flight and safety of the space environment, there should be international sharing of SSA. The question is what model could be and would be applied. There are several proposals by various actors, and I think that in deliberating on these, we have to be very careful what these models would provide. So I think you asked about would there be one database. I'm sure that we can have another 2 hours of discussion of pros and cons on having one database versus an independent system that could verify the certain situations and so forth. So definitely there should be, SSA should be shared internationally. Again, it's not today clear how that would be done in a collaborative efforts, but there are various discussions multilaterally in the UN as well as among partners you mentioned in the allied like-minded format, and that this will inevitably be ongoing, these debates.
Scotty?
Personally, I absolutely think this is a great idea. I have serious concerns about how the governance would apply to that, how the United States would contribute to that. on a kind of a more humorous note, when we stood up the multinational space collaboration effort, which is a mouthful, we really wanted to call it the International Space Situational Awareness Center, or ISAC, but we didn't quite get there. However, I do absolutely agree with both of my panelists that an international database eventually will have to evolve.
Thank you. One of our audience members asks, what constitutes evidence of behavior contrary to space safety and sustainability? How do we define that? And if it can't be collaborated by, or corroborated by multiple entities, is it useful? Any of the panelists?
Well, I can speak to how the United States is looking at that, and in fact, we have not entirely defined what bad behavior in space looks like. We have certainly an idea of what we think nefarious activity is, but we're having a problem writing that down. For many, many years, even back to when Doug was in space policy, we have tried to define that, and we've struggled with it.
Great. Virginia?
I think, well, on the European side, I think we, at least for the EUSST program, we're not there yet. We don't include, well, object characterization. That's done, of course, on the national side. So if you include reconnaissance, for instance, so verification is not something that's currently included, but there has been a debate, especially in the context of hybrid operations, also, Jana, what you mentioned, on how to include these kind of aspects and how to verify them in the end. But that's been set to the side for now.
Mm-hmm.
I think I will just add that in terms of what I said about stepping back and looking at where we are. For example, in Europe, when we are looking at cyber strategy at the EU level, and then we look at what is happening in terms of hybrid operations on a more general, in the maritime arena, for example, what is happening in terms of governance. There's some, we probably going to have to streamline that more. For example, in the cyber strategy, space is not mentioned as a potential critical infrastructure. Issues deal with that. Whereas in the space strategy, the cyber threat is mentioned. So again, this will have to be from a policy perspective. I think there will be more and more attention paid to this as we face these potentially non-cooperative and maybe nefarious activities in space. And what I will just say as generally, for example, currently I think the policy is a no response, just observation of various activities. The question is, does that create some kind of potentially negative norms of behavior that might be later harder to walk back? And this is not clear, but probably down the road we want to create some kind of signaling in terms of these kind of activities. And again, go back to deterrence. How do we deter them?
I have one safe ground on that, Doug.
Sure.
I mean, obviously, the 2007 shoot down was bad behavior. A potential nuclear detonation in orbit is bad behavior. I mean, there's obviously boundaries on this thing. But as we're moving forward, and many companies, some of these in this room, are looking at doing orbital servicing. I mean, that is really going to be interesting when we get there. So we really need to think about these distances. I mean, orbital servicing, they're going to be on top of each other. So I mean, there's really no way to determine that until it's happening, until after the fact.
Great, thank you. One of the questions that I discussed with General Whiting that one of the audience members would like to get your impression on is, how do we balance transparency of SSA information with the protection of sensitive national level sovereign space information? Don't everybody jump into this at once now.
I think I can start and lead it to Regina, because I think she's well positioned to respond to this question. She mentioned the EU SST model.
That is known as throwing your co-panelists under the microphone.
but she mentioned the EU SST model. I mean, and talking about SSA and SST being potentially the next flagship, European flagship problem. But before we get there, this is actually the issue of sovereignty and transparency. That's why, currently the model, and you can elaborate on that, respects the sovereignty and the way the data are being shared and so forth. So I think that's an interesting example.
Thank you for that. No, I agree. I don't want to spill the beans, but I mean, currently what we share in EUSST is 95% unclassified. So that's one answer, I think. Of course, there is a reason why the member state model was pursued and why it's still being pursued by the pressure of the member states, not just the ones that are involved in EUSST at the moment, but also the others who want to join, and also the even 10 more that are interested in participating. Because at the moment, we still have this paradigm of retaining control over sensors. The question, and that's just what I'm asking myself personally, because we have these weekly meetings where we trade off exactly these kind of questions on how we share data from the technical side, how you put in place the protocols, the infrastructure, who should do it, who can see what kind of products, how is this impacted on by specializing different capabilities, even within our small consortium. We're just 5 member states. And then I'm personally asking myself the question, what's going to happen when we really want to make larger investments together in Europe, because we cannot do it as a single, mostly the investments we can't do as single member states. The question then is, who owns the data that comes out of these sensors? And I think at the latest you get to that discussion then. And I think it's something that we have currently put aside, or let's say we have postponed it to the next financial framework, because what's tabled right now in this proposal is that we still discuss this idea of a blueprint of this member state governance model. But after 2028, who knows?
Mm-hmm. Scotty?
I absolutely have a comment on this one. So I want to just tell a quick story. Very recently at U.S. Strategic Command, we hosted a nation, a non-traditional spacefaring nation, and they presented a briefing that showcased how with a just a half-meter telescope and collaboration with a number of universities around the globe, we're able to map the entire geobelt. They compared the data that they had to the data on spacetrack.org and ISON and a couple of other sources. And they came up with 6 satellites that they couldn't find anywhere. They're clearly there, they just couldn't name them. So they, during this discussion, they looked at us straight in the face and said, "Are these those satellites?" Obviously, it put me and Rob Rigo and Jeff Braxton in a really tough position. We can't acknowledge it, but he was absolutely accurate in his assessment. You can't hide school buses in space. GSAP has enabled us to see everything that's going on in the geobelt. We should be able to publish that information. We're not telling anybody what it's doing. We're just telling people that it's there. And I continue to fight this battle every single day.
I can tell you that Scotty is fighting this battle every day, and unfortunately losing, I think. Let's see. Now you talked about the competition for the hearts and minds of spacefaring nations that we see going on right now between China and Russia and the Western world, and how we would view this. For each of our panelists, do we view this as a real threat? And if so, what should our reactions be? What changes in our policy would make this less worrisome?
Well, Doug, as you and I talked about yesterday before our discussion today, we talked about how the U.S. government really isn't set up to talk to those other nations. We are so focused on the more advanced nations, those the nations that have been our closest partners. And we aren't really paying attention, unfortunately, to the more emerging space-faring nations. We have, I've witnessed this very recently with some trips to South America. What my colleagues were talking about in Argentina, we saw some things in Peru just 3 weeks ago, how Russia and China are both establishing themselves down there, and the relationships are not good with the host nation. And these nations are looking for assistance. And whether it's coming from the United States or from a France or from a Germany or another well-advanced nation, I think we really owe it to not just to ourselves, but to the international space community to reach out and assist these nations as much as we can. Once again, I'd like to think that there's an integrated national strategy to do this, but there really isn't. However, we're relying on the DER Space Force and Southcom and EUCOM and CENTCOM to kind of lead us down those roads, and when they sense that there's those not altruistic activities taking place, that maybe we can reach out and try to support those things.
Okay.
I think I would just add to it. I think first of all we should maybe understand what is going on in these countries in terms of these other space partnership arrangements. Are these because I think in a lot of the cases the countries might even understand what they're getting into, but they're you know the government that there is in place agreed to it, and then the successive governments basically don't have a way how to walk back some of these arrangements. And so I think that what is happening, we haven't really in space been looking into that another domain. You talked about cross-domain and how important that is for deterrence. We haven't really been looking into the economic and financial side, because this is actually something that you wouldn't normally think of, because these are legal financial markets. You know, this is not an illegal activity, possibly in a lot of times, but it's just that a lot of in some cases, non-market terms are being put in place, and this is something Western companies and U.S. companies are not able to do simply because of the way they're set up and operate in the free market terms and under the rules that they operated in the Western markets and so forth. So I think first understanding, secondly is, as you said, have a strategy. What is the counter offer? Do we have something on offer, and is this going to be better? I think that will be something we will probably have to deliberate down the road.
I would echo both of Scotty's and Jana's points. I mean, that's why we're interested also in the work that you were doing or you're developing on these kind of topics very much. I mean, on the European side, of course, we're embedded in certain global fora, and I think we have our work cut out for us in that context. But I think the general debate on this begs the question of who is entitled, or not capable, but entitled to work in this domain. Is it just those actors with a primary interest in safeguarding maneuverable assets in a certain orbit, or is it simply anyone who can contribute a small part or a larger element to a certain capability? And I mean, there are lots of different actors out there and lots of different granularities of actor as well. So I think that goes back to your point about what the counteroffer is and who can have a share in this market.
Great, thank you. We've spoken about how good SSA can help deter war. One of the audience members asks, is there an analog that says bad SSA could go ahead and escalate a war? And if so, how do we guard against that?
I mean, I would just briefly mention back the space hybrid operations. The reason why perhaps this is now coming out into the open source discussion is because we are really lacking policies. and basically procedures for and chain of command kind of reactions on some of these activities. And that's why we don't really have a clear escalation ladder in terms of these activities. And that's why we wouldn't probably be talking about this even a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. People would look at me like she's some warmongering crazy person who is trying to bring war to space, you know. But what you said is actually the goal, to prevent that war. And that's a very thin line to walk. And that's why we have to understand it better. And the SSA, I think, contributes very significantly to that.
You know, I'll add, while everybody else doesn't want to jump in on this, thank you, John, for doing so. I often think back to the Iridium Cosmos collision that occurred back in 2009. And of course, there could have been an accusation that was an active attack by a U.S.-controlled satellite on a Russian satellite, or a demonstration of such a possible attack. And SSA data could actually show what happened and how this occurred. Bad SSA data could have been used to show that no, the maneuvers that Iridium made were intentional, to go ahead and try to go ahead and hit the satellite. So this kind of data, the attribution of acts in space and the attribution of the intentions of what those acts mean could easily go ahead and get away from us in the case of bad SSA data, in my opinion. I don't know, Scotty, anything to add?
I just have one comment on that. Certainly bad SSA would be bad. Especially in this world now.
You can take that one to the bank, folks. There it is.
Thank you. Obviously, in this world we're living in with fake news, this is something we're going to have to deal with. I would harken back to our discussion about the non-traditional data preprocessor. It does allow us to bring in partner and ally observations. However, we have to run those observations through not just the filter at the CSPOC, but also through Air Force Space Command, who checks them against certain standards to make sure that the data is good, that it meets some of the requirements. And I can't speak directly to that, but we ensure the data that we do bring into the NDPP, into the CSPOC, into the database is as accurate as it can be currently.
I would just maybe add, when we're talking about why countries, why certain actors, why generally countries conduct these hybrid reversible operations, is that to test the gaps, and I think that could help then identify potential ways forward in terms of when we understand where we are most vulnerable, then probably we can figure out a way how to send message. I mean, I think always the example of SBIRS is used, that as a no-go, like that if an actor wants to disable the infrared system for missile defense, then they would not. That would be across a step too far. The question is then, how do you send that message? And in what way is that clear to the potential adversary that's the case? But maybe we have other areas that today we're not really signaling in any way, and just observing it for the time being.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think in the future, if we think about transforming our regimes into space traffic management, we have more assets and thousands of single objects and fleets and who are not necessarily interoperable in different orbits. I mean, we have the risk of mishaps, and I think in any domain, especially in one other big deterrence domain, I think mishaps are one risk that can lead to escalation. And I think especially if we then look at collision avoidance and maneuvering, there's always, because there's some kind of agency inside these activities, I think that does carry the risk.
Okay. So one final question. So we've talked about the fact that that many nations are reluctant to fully share everything that's in their database for classification reasons or for other reasons, and we've talked about the difficulty in having international negotiations. Regina, you mentioned that even amongst the EU, it's tough to go ahead and get everybody to come to agreement on a standard policy. Is there a role for a nonprofit organization to go ahead and jump ahead of our international negotiations. If we look on the web today, we'll find that every satellite that is in space and every object in space is tracked by at least one or two nations who have chosen to publish the data, often with 3 or 4 names by which those satellites would have been known for. Is this something that a non-governmental activity might be best suited for, so we can get away from the reticence or reluctance of governments to go ahead and share this data?
When I was at the EU and we were debating if the EU Code of Conduct would go forward, what would be the implementation mechanism? And, first question is always the funds. Where will the funds come from? Who will pay for it? Even if it's an NGO, is it going to be the governments who fund the NGO? If so, how is the governance structure going to set up of that organization? Who is going to manage it? Is that like two-person operation? Is that a larger scale? So that's one question. And then second question, if in a field like an SSA, which is deals with dual-use nature of space, I think a non-profit on its own, I would think that there should be always a role of governments in that. So an NGO on its own as a contributing element for sure. But I think that it will inevitably will have to be with support of governments. And even then you have always the issue like the Hague Code of Conduct. I mean, we've got a database of launches, but then the most important countries are not there or sharing the information. So then again, it would have to be in a way that is effective if it's set up.
Okay.
I can't comment on the accuracy of those databases, nor have I ever looked at them. However, all kidding aside, I believe it's going to have to be a non-governmental agency to take the lead on this. And they're going to have to be bold and make decisions that are not very popular. And I fully support it when it takes place.
Fantastic. Regina, the final word.
I wouldn't say it's a final word, but it would have been a qualification of what you said. I think I'm really looking at this from our perspective, and that's still very much characterized by governments, surrounded by all these other actors, and our question is much more humble and, should it be supranational or intergovernmental? I mean, that's the current match that we're having in Europe, in a sense, for SSA.
Fantastic. Well, listen, I hope that you'll all join me in a round of applause for these fantastic panelists that we had up here today. Fascinating discussion. Thank you all, and I will turn it back over to Sandy and the team.